Welcome to our 2026 Change Exchange podcast kickoff for ignited change practitioners, keen leaders making change decisions, and those on the front lines dedicated to making tough change happen. I'm Kimberly Shaw, founder and consultant at Changeify, where we specialize in positive change management and organizational transformation for our global clients. People are at the center of what we do, and our mission is to create lasting change that sticks. My Change Exchange partner, Nick Kemp, founder of OD Consulting, helps scores of leaders across the UK and Ireland bring in changes that make business better. Radical, different, and always supportive. I can attest to that. He reshapes ways of working with tangible results. We are thrilled to have Professor Julie Hodges from Durham University Business School with us today. She is a leading international expert on change in organizations, particularly the role and impact of people during transformation. She brings over 20 years of dedicated change experience and wisdom in profit and nonprofit organizations, and has published in a number of international journals on change in organizations, and has written a few books, including her most recent, Managing and Leading People Through Change. Welcome, Julie. Wonderful to have you here with us.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you today.
Now, Nick, you and I have had much on our mutual change minds entering this year. Lots of retrospective and lots of consideration as to ways forward. Perhaps you can elaborate more on what we're hoping to explore today.
Yes, absolutely. This is our first podcast of 2026. And the question that we've got today is essentially one of looking back at what we found change to be like in 2025. And then on the back of that, having discussed and reflected on the issues and the challenges that we had last year, to look forward to the issues and challenges that we want to look at next year, and what we anticipate to be the core conversations we're going to have. So that's our frame, and our intention today is to look at that in a little bit more detail, and start off with maybe we can invite Julie first to talk about the way that she's seen change over the last year emerge and develop, and the key issues that she's been having conversations around.
Sure. Okay, thank you. And thank you both, Kimberly and Nick, for the invitation to join you today. I'm always delighted to be able to talk about organizational change, and particularly with both of you, because I know you bring a lot of experience to this field, in fact. So in terms of, as Kimberly said, I've spent 20 years working in organizations on change, and nearly as much time in academia doing research and consultancy and teaching in that field. So I'm very passionate about organizational change and very passionate about the people element of change. And in terms of your question, Nick, I think over the last 12 months, certainly what I have seen, which has been it's been a real pleasure, as I've seen many more discussions now happening about what I call people-centric change, in fact. And that is really important, because I think traditionally, change has been seen as a top-down process. What I've seen over the last year is a shift to change, yes, needing to be a process, but also in many more organizations now considering what's the impact that change has on people. That's the first thing. But also importantly, whenever feasible, how can people be engaged in the process of change too? And again, what's been heartening over the last year is that managers and leaders actually, rather than just rushing into change, is taking a little bit more time to think about, okay, we have the process here for planned organizational transformations, but actually, who do we need to talk to? Who do we need to talk to, particularly internally in the organization, to make that happen? I think also what I've seen over the last year, and when we talk about what's going to happen in the future, this is going to continue, is about the evolving role of managers in change. And that's about moving from a traditional command and control approach to management to one that's much more facilitative and coaching, and also about more of a care when it comes to the impact of change on people as well too. And the third thing I think, and we can't go without mentioning it, can we, on this podcast, is the emergent technologies that are coming to the fore. And I think particularly the last year has seen much more in the media, much more hype around AI and the implications that that has for change in organizations too.
Those are fantastic observations, Julie. And Nick, you and I have talked about many of these similar themes, especially the fact that we are in this a bit of tension, if you will, between these people-centric practices of ours and technology as it is emerging, and looking at, I think, better ways of not only merging those, but leveraging AI, for example, as a partner, I think, to the work that we do directly, as well as in support of individuals and teams that are going to be practicing, with more intelligence, shall we say.
Yeah, and I think it's about having a hybrid approach where we're using technology in a way that supports the work. So we have people and we have technology, exactly as you said, Kimberly, that are working together. They're not in conflict with each other, but they're creating what I call super teams of technology, super teams of people that are working effectively together. And that will mean that people's capabilities will have to change. It does mean that they'll have to be upskilling. It does mean that there will be changes in types of people's jobs, but I think it's looking at it from a positive perspective rather than seeing AI as something that is going to completely take away all the jobs that people do. What it will do is it will create new and different jobs, and it will mean that in organizations that some of the tactical, operational, technical jobs are done by technology rather than people.
I think that's absolutely right. In terms of what I've seen over the last few months, that's exactly the conversation that I've seen happen. And one of the things I've noticed about last year is that the whole essence seems to be one of curiosity and exploration about what AI is going to be. And I see from a continuum from this is just a better way of taking minutes and meeting notes to this is going to radically change the way that the world is going to look. And for me at the moment, I think there's a testing process going on. I've noticed a bit of a dichotomy between people who are saying this is going to be an emergent and a gradual change to a new way of us working with technology, to being this is going to be something which changes the way that people work in organisations. And I think that what I saw last year is those two conversations running side by side, but not actually touching each other a lot.
Idea about how do we approach, from a change management, from a transformation standpoint, ways of enabling that synergy, Julie, that you were mentioning between sort of emergent technology, in this case AI, and people and their roles. And that piece of capability, I think, is significant because I do believe, and in the AI enablement work that even our own practice is doing, we are seeing a requirement to really lean into organizations to understand strategically what they're up to and how this knits into their planning, but also an understanding as to your point, Julie, as we release people from those tactical, maybe lower priority, lower value roles, have we identified the higher value opportunities, for individuals as well? So I think, Nick, that's part of the approach as well. That's upon us is, how do we assist organizations in being able to not only implement, because it has been an implementation focus, I think, to your point, very much so to this point, and will continue probably through the perceived bubble. But I do wonder, and I am seeing a need for us to really leverage back in with the organizations as to what they're up to when making these decisions.
Yeah, and I think that some organizations at the moment don't know what they don't know, in fact. And I think what you said, Nick, it's a mix of all of these things that is impacting on organizational change at the moment. And we tend to focus on AI, but there's a lot more emergent technologies that are happening now. I mean, there's things like the metaverse, there's digital twins, there's all sorts of elements. And what's going to happen is that these emergent technologies are going to start getting into organizations faster because of the, the capability there now is, in fact. But it's about organizations rather than just jumping on the bandwagon and thinking we've got to keep up with our competitors, and if we don't, we'll be in trouble. Is actually thinking about what is the rationale for why we need to use an emergent technology. Why do we need, and how can we add value? And that's important. Any change has to add value. It's about how can something like AI add value? And therefore, by doing that, what is the impact on the organization's structure, on the environment in which people work, and importantly, on the capabilities, the skills that people need to do their job effectively.
It's a really interesting point. This whole issue about the value add, and I've noticed a real challenge for people to start thinking beyond their own reality, the day job that they're doing, to the value that they're offering, both to the organisation but also to the wider world they're working in, and that's one of the things which I wonder whether that's going to be a challenge for leaders to start thinking about, with the pace of change and the fact that new technologies largely give you the opportunity rather than the requirement, but certainly the opportunity to think beyond your own borders in terms of the way that you work. If there's a need for leaders to start thinking about themselves as being not just leaders within their own environment and their own organisations, but within a wider community and purpose. And it'd be interesting to hear both your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would say that, the concept of ESG has been around for quite a while, and there are some amazing companies who are looking at the wider environment in which they are working, in fact, and ensuring that any change that happens internally, how that impacts externally on things like local communities, supply chains, partnerships, etc. But also, I think there's companies that are looking at what's happening in their local community or their global community, and what does that mean for the company itself. So I think it's very difficult these days for organizations not to consider the wider environment in which they are working in, and also the impact of any changes that they make on that wider environment as well.
I like the mention you made earlier, Julie, around less control being an emergent trait in contemporary leadership, and I tend to align with that in terms of ways in which leadership can be more creative, less controlled, more, I should say, co-created, if you will, at the level of the work. And I think that ties in a little bit to your mention maybe about the power and the changing roles of management, around change. But one of the things that I think is potentially really wonderful is related to your mention of care, leaders as stewards of cultures of care, and how with all these factors, with all these triggers, with all these influences that we have internally and externally, where I think we are looking increasingly at the whole person, as they're walking into organizations. I am really keen on the opportunity for leadership to be able to potentially reframe itself in response to the environment and the wild world of change, as Nick and I call it, that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and I think that's where technology comes in. It can do a lot of the transactional tasks that managers have had to do for years and years. So it can take that away from them, which frees up time for managers to actually focus more on engaging with their staff, and whether they do that in a way that is co-creative, whether it's collaborative, but in a way that does. I spoke to someone recently who called it fierce care. It's about sort of building mutual trust, fostering that environment, that we've heard Amy Edmondson and others discuss as psychological safety, where people feel that it's okay to say, actually, this is something we could do differently. This is some improvement that we can make and can contribute to that debate. I think one of the things that it goes back to your original question, Nick, about what have I seen in change? I've seen a lot of people using the right language. So you mentioned co-creation. Kimberly. More and more I hear organizations talking about that. More and more it's about collaboration. Lots of organizations talk about psychological safety these days. However, I think what is really important is not the language is great. It's a first step, and it's recognizing these are important elements of organizational change. Moving forward, it's about how are they actually enacted in practice? Yeah, so in a way, it becomes less of an academic discussion and around these key concepts, and it's actually how is this done in practice? And that does mean about ensuring that managers have the capabilities to be able to shift to a much more facilitative coaching approach when it comes to organizational change as well. But also, I think what's important with managers is that they are involved right at the start with discussions about organizational change rather than being told this is what you'll do and how you will implement it. Also, what's happened last year is there has been a lot more what's called transformational change happening in organizations. So we hear people talking about change as constant. It's happening all the time in organizations at the moment. There are debates about whether change is getting faster or not, and that's debatable. I think what's happening is there is more change that's occurring now. But when we talk about people talk about constant change, they're talking about incremental change. They're talking about the change we see all around us all the time. And it's no big deal often. We switch on our computer in the morning, we have to log in slightly differently. These changes happen constantly. Processes might be tweaked slightly. What has been happening over the last year, and this is why change is causing concern in some organizations, is that there's more transformational change. And transformational change is change that has described as hitting the deep structure of an organization. So it hits an organization's strategy. It hits their mission, their vision. It hits the core capabilities that they need within an organization. And that change is complex, it's chaotic, it doesn't happen in a linear fashion, and it can be really messy.
Yeah. This is fascinating and really insightful, I think, about what we've seen happen last year. What I'd like to do as well is to start thinking a little bit more about, okay, well, having seen all these things happen last year, what do we anticipate seeing next year? What do we expect organizations to be talking about, which is going to be new and fresh? And what are the things that we haven't heard this year that really we'd like to hear people talk about next year?
I think we're going to see the use of technology more, and particularly AI, in how we actually do change in organizations. So there's technology there now that can do a lot of the gathering the data, analyzing the data, looking at what the root causes are, etc. So I think that's quite exciting that we start to look at how can we use AI in terms of how we manage change more effectively in organizations. I think, though, there'll also be more of a focus on the impact of change on people as well, both in terms of their health, their well-being, and the skills that they require. So the current book that I'm writing, my 11th book on organizational change, is about well-being and organizational change. And I think we really do need to look more at that, because organizational change, particularly transformational change, if it is mismanaged, it can impact people's anxiety levels, it can cause stress, and ultimately it can cause burnout. So I think all change creates uncertainty. There's no doubt about that. And we need to look at how we can grasp uncertainty. All change creates ambiguity, but it's the change when it's mismanaged that it can actually create some very negative impacts on people's health and well-being. And I think we need to be having more conversations around that element as well.
Absolutely. And I think this plays into, which I think is a theme that's been threading through the conversation so far, is the imperative, I think, on change and transformation practitioners around the design and structure of change delivery to be able to consider not just the deliverables, because we're kings and queens of that. But to your point, that view of how we are carrying people through the change, how we're building not only the capability, but also protecting their wellness, as you're pointing out, with the demands that you've highlighted, and we live them also as a practice. So I think about this as a leader of my own team, relative to how they're coping and managing, in the midst of all of this chaotic, constant, and pivoting levels of work. But I'm curious as to our collective thoughts about some of the approaches that we've seen in change, around our ability to design and structure, and I hate to say the word programs, but experiences that necessarily support and promote quality of the change that we're delivering.
That's a very good point, and I think I'd like to pick up on that, but also circle back to Julie, your point about transformational change and what that means, because transformation is probably, in my opinion, one of the most overused words in the English language, or certainly in my world, because we talk about transformative change as being something which is quite often not transformative at all. It's transactional and it's incremental. And my sense is that where we're going next year is a process where we will do some accommodation of the new technologies which are coming in, and we'll try and work things in the same way as we always have worked them, but accommodate them. So we'll build them into roles. We'll do things slightly different. I think real transformation will come when we start recognizing the value of the new technology, particularly AI and agentic AI, in redefining the role of a lot of people in a lot of organizations. Quite a lot of those white collar, simple transactional roles will disappear. And that for me is fully transformational, but it's also deeply disruptive. It redefines what it is that our role in organizations. It redefines the role of middle managers, potentially, in organizations. And the real challenge here, I think, is yes, it's a management issue, but it's also a leadership one. It's about setting our expectations about how the world will change, not next year, but maybe within the next 5 years, and how organizations will redesign and remodel, to your point, Julie. I think that's going to be the real challenge for change leadership, to help them steer to a different type of organization, which is going to be possible in the future.
Yeah, and I would say it's happening now, Nick. I think that's actually happening in organizations now, that they're having to, having to pivot to new operating models to take into account the emerging technologies. But also, I mean, we talk about AI, and AI is it's been with us for a long time. The term was first defined in the 1950s, and those of us that are old enough can remember the days before iPhones, before Google, before emails, etc. So we have lived and breathed the evolution of technology, and it will continue to happen. It's not going to stop. And I think that's exciting, actually. As I said earlier, it's about how it's used, how it informs changes and different operating models and structures in organizations. That's important. I think also thinking about it's not just AI that's disrupting organizations. There's geopolitical issues that are happening. There's economic, there's social issues as well. And it's that's that bag of, in a way, mega trends that are hitting organizations that is causing more of the disruption rather than just one significant element, in fact, that's important. With transformations, I use that term because in the academic world, we define change in terms of incremental and transformational. But it's the transformations that are the tougher elements of change, definitely, that we need to be considering as well.
I would also support that they're the tremendous opportunities. We do, I would say, predominantly transformational change, where it does tend to be all about the long game, where there is an emphasis on managing the complexity and carrying, I would say, a series of solutions, really, right, to multitude problems. I think it's that agility piece that comes into that work. But I think it also provides us a tremendous window to the heart and soul of organizations and how teams and individuals resonate and really function in those walls. And to your point, I love that phrase "megatrends" because I think we are part of a megatrend in general that confronts our practice, I think, in meaningful ways relative to how we incorporate those things as part of our practice and how we resonate with teams and individuals, and also, support leaders in terms of the landscapes in which they're maneuvering. Decisions are not easy these days. If they ever were, I think they're more confounded, more conflicted, more challenged, and they need to be more informed more than ever.
Yeah, indeed. And I think also you're absolutely spot on, Kimberly, but also a lot of these decisions are having to be made quicker as well, aren't they? And that's the key thing. And AI can help make these decisions if it's, effectively utilized and used to get knowledge and information too. So it's how things like AI can be used to help with some of the issues that leaders are facing as well at the moment. That's important. You also made a really good point there about the need for agility. I think absolutely it's the need for agility, adaptability, and flexibility that's important too. And in a lot of the work that I write about organizational change, it is about looking at what are the key capabilities, the skills, the knowledge, the experience that I would say both leaders and managers, because change needs both. And I do feel that often the managers are the ones that are left out, because often the decision comes from the top down and managers are told to go on and implement a certain change without actually having been involved in the discussion. So that's why I do think there has to be a reframing of managers to get them much more involved at an earlier stage with discussions about change. Yeah, and I think it goes back, you rightly say that often we tend to lump all change into one barrel and say it's change. But actually, your point that you made, Nick, is that there are different types of change. So we have, the classic planned change where we can sit down and say, okay, we want to, acquire a company in East Asia, or we want to start using chatbots in our customer services. That can be planned, can't it? The other type of change, though, and there's many other types, but the other type of change that you've touched upon is what's called emergent change that happens without us being able to plan it. And that emergent change, as you said, is things like the pandemic. It's things about what's coming out of the, countries such as the States at the moment on things like tariffs. And these are less easy to plan for. In fact, it's about reacting to them. And linking to your point about what is it that leaders and managers need, they need the ability, which picks up on Kimberly's point, to be able to adapt and be flexible to these things that are emerging as well as the planned change. And because emergent change is much more, as we know from our experience of the pandemic, is much more complex, and there's not a rule book that says this is what you should do, tick, 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 with the change. I think that does need the leaders and managers to be able to be more responsive, more flexible, adaptable to what's coming out from these different elements.
Yeah, I absolutely get that as well. I think that for me, there's a slight difference between planned change, emergent change, and disruptive change, because we can have change which is emergent but non-disruptive. And one of the things I'm particularly interested in next year is how do we deal with radical disruptive influences which will require us to make choices about the way we do things. And that's going to be an interesting conversation, I think.
Things that comes to mind as we talk about these trends, if we will, or these, geopolitical, social political factors, is our relationship to other competences, other functions, other practices in organizations such as DEI, for example. And this relates back to some of the wellness conversation, I believe, Julie, that you mentioned earlier. Psychological safety, I think, is at the heart and soul of some of the assumptions, programming, and even legislation that I think we've seen contemporarily are challenged. to put it lightly. And something I think that when we speak of it even generationally is a first for a number of us, right? We haven't seen some of these things, or these are our sort of first experiences. And I guess in listening to sort of that which is disruptive or that which is emergent, one of the big conversations that's coming out of associations that I'm a part of and volunteer activities is this importance to really, really take a moment and understand these landscapes that people are operating in, especially if we're doing global levels of change, where we, historically cross borders pretty easily, where, we are able to navigate culture relatively, seamlessly with some awareness and understanding. I think there is a level of almost existentialism, a little bit of crisis around belonging. How do we create inclusive programs? How do we identify, diversity in the work that we're doing, and more importantly, define equity in the decisions and the deliverables that we're supporting. So I just wanted to toss that in there because I do think that's very contemporary, for us. And I don't think it's a bad exercise at all for us to be going through as we consider really, again, getting back to kind of the heart and soul of why we exist.
Yeah, and it picks up on you're absolutely right. And it picks up on something that's not always considered when we talk about change is how that impacts on somebody's identity, so that's quite a complex element in terms of, what people identify within the workplace, in terms of the job that they do, the team that they work with, the manager that they have as well. And any change does disrupt someone's identity if it's impacting on the actual role that they do. And if that's not managed effectively, then that can lead to poor well-being.
Yeah, I love the work that Robert Dilt did in his logical levels with identity being right at the top, which actually which helped people define what it was that their contribution was to the organisation, why they were there, and that as a frame for the way in which people work, I think is going to be really important. It always has been important, but I think that the conversation we're having at the moment, and your point, Julie, just re-emphasises the fact that people need to actually believe that what they're doing has value and purpose.
Yeah.
Right to the point you made at the beginning of this call, in fact, where you talked about all change has to have value.
Definitely. And it's about, I think, and that again goes back to managers being able to have the conversations with people as well. And the conversations that we're not particularly always good at about how change impacts on our emotions. So in my book about managing and leading people through change, it looks at change as an emotional process. Change does hit how people feel. It hits how they react as well. And it's about managers having the ability to actually have conversations with people to say about how do they feel about the change rather than just how they think. Because through these conversations, if there's an environment of trust, obviously, of mutual trust, then that can start to unpack how people think the change is impacting on their identity and why they may be reacting in a certain way as well. Because the biggest thing that has not gone away, and is the question I'm always asked, is about how do you deal with people that resist change? And my view is that people don't resist change, they resist having change imposed on them. And if they're told this is what they have to do, and nobody's actually said anything to them before then obviously they'll react in a way that may appear to be negative towards the change itself. So it is about not losing sight in this era of, transformation, era of technology, having conversations with people about the change and how it will affect them.
One of the questions that I have, and this may be a way for us to close our conversation today, is in light of and in sight of all the things that we think are upon us and that we are going to be facing, what do we feel is important for the change practitioner, the change professional, the transformation deliverer to consider as part of their toolkit, as part of their practice.
I'd be interested to hear from both of you, as you know, from your perspective. This is the work that you do, isn't it?
Yes.
What are you seeing out there? What do you think is important?
Shall we close this by having one statement each on that brilliant question? What do we see this as being the impact on the change practitioner? And seeing as I'm already speaking, I'll just give you my view. My view is that the change practitioner needs to stop thinking about change as being about AI or about any other sort of technology, but we need to start thinking about it as being about people. And because ultimately the only thing that changes in any change process are the people and their behavior. All the other things are conditions, they're not changes. It's only the people who are the things that change, because is that element of change which allows everything else to take place. So my view is that the change manager should stop thinking about change as being fundamentally about process and about technology, and more about how do you change people's perspectives of what they're contributing and help them do stuff different. All the others are just things that are just tools. They're not the change.
Yeah, really good point, Nick. I think it is about getting a balance between the process side of change and the people side of change, isn't it? Because I think up until now it's been very heavy on process and a bit lighter on the people side of it as well. I would say, though, it's also about moving from the concept of change being something, that's tough and that's hard and that's awful and it's only done at certain times, is actually moving the discussion to change being seen as an opportunity as well. I think change often gets really negative press, but it's about looking at change as an opportunity.
Absolutely. And I think I would add to all of our thoughts here from a practitioner's perspective, where I'm leveling up in our game and our practice is around really intentional design of change initiatives and experiences that are considerate, that are caring, and that are inclusive relative to the work that we're trying to do. So really leaning into the change organization, if you will, the people structures that we're designing to not only deliver the functional and technical needs of our work, but to really go through the experience and come out more capable and ideally, creating better organizations at the end.
Yeah, and that's a brilliant point. And just to say that comes through seeing change not only as adding value, but also as being an opportunity to reflect and to learn from it. And I think what would be really helpful if organizations really took time to look at what have we learned from this? What can we do differently? Even when change is not successful and it fails, is actually taking time to think about what could we do differently? What can we stop doing? What can we start doing? And how can we do things differently so that we don't fail the next time, but actually to learn from it?
And I think on that note, I think we should maybe say that we've done this subject as well as we can in the time available, and it only remains for me to thank Julie Hodges. Thank you very much for coming and joining us on the Change Exchange, and from Kimberly Shaw and myself, Nick Kemp, we'll see you the next time round.